Hello, everyone. My name is Spencer Ruchty. I'm the author events manager here at Third Place Books in Seattle, Washington. Welcome to tonight's program. I hope you're all wearing proper attire, as I am, I believe. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to tonight's conversation with Matthew Specktor and Lili Anolik, who are both here to talk about Crashing in the Same Car on Art Crisis in Los Angeles, California, this wonderful book published last week by Tin House Books. Through virtual events like tonight's, Third Place Books is very fortunate to continue connecting readers with authors in an intimate setting. We do sorely miss having authors in our store, but at the same time, we're so thankful to have this new platform that brings our growing event series into your homes and all across the world. Thank you again for tuning in and for supporting independent bookstores. Before we begin tonight, I just have a few events on our upcoming calendar that I wanted to plug. First, we have Mona Awad in conversation with Heather O'Neill tomorrow night, August 5th, where they'll be discussing Mona's Shakespearean novel called All's Well. We have Kira Jane Buxton on August 24th for her new novel Feral Creatures, the sequel to Hollow Kingdom, which is a bookseller favorite over here. And I'm personally excited about our virtual event with the literary horror sci-fi multi-hyphenate writer Brian Evanson for his short story collection, The Glassy Burning Floor of Hell, which is going to be in conversation with Lincoln Michelle on August 11th. You can find our full events calendar on our website at thirdplacebooks.com, where I also encourage you to sign up for our email newsletter. In a couple minutes, down in the chat below, I will be sharing a link to purchase Always Crashing in the Same Car. If you're in the Seattle area, you can purchase the book online and pick it up in the store, or you can just swing by any one of our locations at Lake Forest Park, Ravenna, or Seward Park. We have plenty of copies on hand. We have book plates signed by Matthew himself, courtesy of Tin House, and we're happily open to the public. We ship all across the country. We're eager to get these books in your hands. So, during tonight's event, I'd also like to remind you that the chat window at the bottom of your screen is open, and we encourage you to use it respectfully. Tonight, we also have some time for your questions. So if you have questions for our authors this evening, please submit those in the Q&A window below, which is separate from the chat window at the bottom of your screen. We also offer closed captioning for those who are interested. You can just hit the live transcript button at the bottom of your window to turn this feature on or off. And finally, as you may have experienced in some virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise, but if they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly. So thank you so much for your patience and understanding. Overall, thank you for listening and to sticking around with us during this virtual era. It's strictly because of you, really, that this author series is even possible. And now let's introduce tonight's speakers. Matthew Specktor is the author of the novels American Dream Machine and That Summertime Sound, a nonfiction book called The Sting, and the forthcoming memoir, The Golden Hour. He is the co-founding editor of the Los Angeles Review of Books, which, in my opinion, continues to publish some of the most interesting essays and criticism on film, literature, and art. And whenever there's a new Robert Walser collection out, you can guarantee that they're going to have coverage. Matthew's own work has been published in the New York Times, the Paris Review, The Believer, and elsewhere. Joining Matthew in conversation tonight is Lili Anolik, a contributing editor at Vanity Fair, whose work has also appeared in Harper's, Esquire, and The Believer. But I've always known her as one of the country's resident Eve Babitz experts. Lili is also the accomplished author of the biography Hollywood's Eve, Eve Babitz and the Secret History of L.A. So if you've ever had a passing interest in Babitz's work, Lili's biography is a must-read. Perhaps we can talk more about Babitz during this discussion tonight. We'll see where the night takes us, but the real topic tonight's Discord is, of course, Always Crashing in the Same Car, this brilliant memoir slash collection of essays slash history slash erudite work of what I think is universal insights into relationships, self-destructive behavior, and I think the way art and art making follows us through some of our most difficult moments. So without further ado, I want to thank you all for taking time out of your busy evenings to be with us. It is such a pleasure for me to welcome Matthew Specktor and Lili Anolik. The virtual stage is yours.
Hi. First of all, I still can't quite believe that they made a T-shirt.
I know. I was so excited about this. People need to make more T-shirts out of books.
Yeah, I wish they would. I do own that T-shirt myself, although I'm not yet to be Shameless, and it feels like wearing your own band's t-shirt.
I know, it's like exactly, it's kind of like faux
My
pas.
wife and my dog have seen me in it so far, but I'm willing to sport it in public, but I think it's amazing. And also, speaking of technical difficulties, I just wanted to mention that the potential technical difficulty that could arise on this end is my dog, who is currently very quietly napping beneath my chair, and I aim to keep it that way. But it's a little like sitting on a hand grenade, so we'll see how that goes. I thought I would start by reading a little tiny, or just a short excerpt from the section of the book on Tuesday Weld, which is also a section about a friend of mine, a sort of lost friend who came back into my life for a while. So I'm just going to read from that for a second, and then Lili, you know why I'm choosing this section, but I will remind you, and I will explain to everyone else why I'm reading this part as well after I've done it. My friend D left me a message. I hadn't spoken to him for more than a decade, but I checked my phone one afternoon, and there it was, his voice, high-strung and excitable, dropping one word in a strangulated whisper. Freak. Click. That was it, but it was all I needed. It meant D had quit drinking again, that inside the manic, beautiful cartoon of his being, he'd found electricity and needed to share it. I called him back, but we found ourselves trading messages for a few weeks before we finally connected. In the end, it would be worth it, although I worried for a while whether to speak would be to encourage him. His equilibrium had always been volatile. Even now, after another 10 years have passed since I last heard it, his voice sizzles through my head, musical, exuberant, with a born raconteur's flair for the exaggerated pause, telling ribald and ridiculous stories about Orson Welles and Eudora Welty, Marianne Moore and Billy Collins, stories that didn't even have to be accurate to be true somehow. There was no tracking Dee's manic enthusiasms, no way of knowing what song or film or novel he'd want to talk about at 2 in the morning or 4 in the afternoon. But even after we spoke, I was concerned about him. He seemed lonely and bereft, and he was recently divorced with a young daughter, just like I was. Then again, all the more reason to lean back into our friendship. God knows I needed someone to talk to. I was living now where I had been since shortly before my mother died, the bottom floor of a duplex on 6th Street, about a mile and a half south of 1448 Hayward on the line. A wide and quiet street lined with Spanish-style houses and sycamore trees, a green oasis far from the sign-cluttered chaos of the Strip. Here I tried at last to get my head straight. I cut back on my drinking and what had been, in the aftermath of my separation, an impulse to promiscuity, encounters that had left me, and no doubt other people, feeling empty. I woke up early and went running, took long walks around the neighborhood in the AM fog. A young woman in a knit cap strolled by me on the sidewalk daily, flanked by a pair of enormous St. Bernards, her eyes wide like a Greek statue's. Watching her vanish back into the mist, silent, inexplicable, I felt half apparitional myself, indentured still to my mother's ghost. Where had she gone? Where had I? On Sundays and Wednesdays, my daughter slept over, and on the following mornings, I would take her to school, holding her small, soft hand like an astronaut's tether as we padded across the playground. What did my feelings of failure even matter as I listened to the rattle of kindergarten laughter, watched V trail away into her classroom, the reverse Orphic joy, the ecstatic horror of seeing the person you love most disappear into the future? Hearing from D had shaken something loose in me. We'd met a decade and a half earlier when we were both living in New York City, and we both, I more insistently than he, I suppose, wanted to be writers. We were 25, 26, that age when wishful thinking bends a little harder into the need to execute your ambition. We'd hung around one another constantly, stayed up late, talking about everything under the sun. Philip Roth and Cormac McCarthy, James Baldwin and Toni Morrison, George Eliot and Virginia Woolf. And then he got married and moved back home to Richmond, planning to start a family. Last I'd heard, he'd gone to law school. And then we lost touch, the way it was easy to do in that pre-social media era. I'd heard rumors that he'd fallen on hard times, that he'd been diagnosed as bipolar and may have spent some time in a psychiatric hospital. His alcoholism had come around to bite him in the ass. But the moment we spoke, I felt bound to him again as my secret twin. He wanted to talk and talk about many things, but the first things he wanted to say were about Tuesday Weld. Have you seen her, freak? He hit me with a soft pause, which then extended. It was like he was modulating the silence even over the phone, controlling its qualities like all raconteurs do. I mean, have you seen her? Yeah, man, I've seen her. I had, but where? Like a lot of Gen Xers, I'd seen her on the front cover of Matthew Sweet's album Girlfriend, which featured Weld in a fur-lined hoodie, her skin the roseate pink of a glacier kissed by dawn. I'd seen her in Michael Mann's Thief and in Sergio Leone's Once Upon a Time in America. I'd seen her in the 1977 adaptation of Judith Rosner's novel Looking for Mr. Goodbar, a film that had terrified me when I saw it as a teenager. I'd seen her most recently as Mariah Wyeth in Frank Perry's Play It As It Lays. But beyond this, a handful of apparitions, I was ignorant. Was there a story? What about her, freak? Are there any essential Weld daddies I should know about? Dee and I had evolved this style of talking, an obnoxious paleo beatnik patter years ago in New York. Why it should have persisted, I don't know. The silliness of it allowed us to amplify our enthusiasms, maybe, to turn our intrigues into manias. Like all geeks, really, we wanted persona through which to filter excitement, turn fandom's one-way love, ever shameful and lonely, into communion. Lord love a duck, man. Lord love a duck is the crucial Tuesday juice. On it. I knew he wasn't talking about Weld's physical beauty. He was talking about presence, some electrical quality that was also about him and me. Such is the trouble with masculinity, it seems. We are always hiding our love for one thing behind another. Dee would call and be wound up about Elizabeth Bishop or Joni Mitchell, and I would know he was trying to show me something, but also to conceal it, pulsing inside his aloneness like a firefly inside a jar.
That's lovely.
Thank you. But you know, the reason I wanted to read that passage, aside from the fact that I kind of feel like that's something that you and I do a little bit. Like we call each other up to talk things, books, people, movies.
What's weird, Matthew, is actually like I have like 2 pages here, like typewritten pages, but like the one quote I have from the book that I wanted to ask you about is, "Such is the trouble with masculinity. We are always hiding our love for one thing behind another," which I absolutely love and think is true, but I don't understand it. And I really want you to explain this to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe that was a line I wanted to read just because I wanted to unpack it a little. I think, because I think that it is true. Like, I think that over the years of my, really going back to when I was a teenager, I've had, friendships, male friendships, particularly, that feel very often feel very rooted in this kind of like, obsessiveness about music, obsessiveness about literature, obsessiveness about movies, and I feel like, if I look at my close male friendships, even, it's like with someone like Lethem or something, with Jonathan Lethem, it's like there's an email chain. It's like there's a single email chain that's about like 12,000 messages long, and it's just this kind of ongoing, like, do you have this record? Can I borrow this? Will you send me this? Have you seen this? Look at this YouTube clip. Look at this. And I don't think that's all that unusual. I think lots of, or maybe that's a very Gen X thing, but I think people do that. And I think I do it with some of my female friends like you, but I really do it with my male friends. And I do think that is a way that men, there've been movies about that, right? Or other books about that. High Fidelity was about that, like, about this kind of way in which, men communicate or fail to communicate a lot of the times, right? Because it can get very, people can get kind of ridiculous about their opinions, or defensive about them, or snobbish, which is even worse. I think in this case there was never anything snobbish about it, but there was something about it where I knew that there was something underneath it that couldn't be spoken any other way.
No, not communicated directly, right? I get that.
Right, and I wonder whether that's true. It's obviously true because masculinity is broken, but also, maybe more broadly true or more softly true, just in kind of how we relate to art in general. It's like if you read something that you love, or you see something that you love, or you hear something that you love, it's like there's a conflicting interest. There's a conflicting impulse maybe maybe on the one hand to sort of feel like this is my private thing, but also an impulse to share it with other people. And what does that mean? What does that really mean?
Well, no, you're communicating, but picking Tuesday Weld as your favorite starlet, say, you're communicating a lot about yourself, right? That's a very idiosyncratic choice. And actually, this is something I wanted to ask you. This book is besotted with failure. I mean, it's in love with failure, and she's kind of a failed starlet. And you bring that up in your piece on her in this kind of great way. She's really known for the roles she didn't take.
Right. Much more than the roles she did take. And I think the movies in which we remember her, like most people remember her for, if they remember her, for Thief, for Fun Time in America, for the late roles where she's playing characters who are broken. But I think the kind of earlier, the movies that kind of from her young career or early career are mostly things that people hadn't seen, you know. I think in many ways, and I do want to say, you know, that you are half responsible for this chapter about Tuesday Weld. The funny thing is that I knew I wanted to write about my friend at some point, because his story was sort of, you know, that's a whole other kind of failure. Yeah. But I also, the chapter, as I had outlined the book and as I had sold it, was originally going to be about a screenwriter named Claire Noto, who's got a fascinating story. But I had some ambivalence about trying to kind of drag her into it, because I felt like I'd already written about a screenwriter, and I think, you know, kind of like I wanted to kind of change media a little bit, but I hadn't actually decided to write about Tuesday Weld until we were out to dinner. You and I and Brett Ellis were having dinner, and I think you and Brett, I don't remember which one of you did first. I was talking about the book, and one of you said, and maybe it was Brett, but I said Tuesday. You got to write about Tuesday.
Well, it's a funny thing, because I had done a piece for Vanity Fair on Joan Didion in Hollywood from like 64 to 72, but it had started out trying to be about the making of Play It As It Lays, because the obsession with Tuesday Weld, right? But she couldn't be gotten to. I remember us talking about that. There's something so elusive about her that's so appealing too.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, you know, elusive, and I think in a very, part of it is the elusiveness of her having, like, not, you know, her, as you say, her being known for movies she didn't take more than movies she did, right? She turned down Bonnie and Clyde. She turned down Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice. Lolita, right. Cactus Flower, which Goldie Hawn, right? You know, all of those things. And I really wish she had taken Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice, because then she would have acted with my father-in-law.
That's right, Robert Culp, of course. Yeah. Oh God, yeah, that's amazing. Actually, you never mentioned Pretty Poison. I wanted to know, what's your favorite Tuesday performance?
Probably Pretty Poison is her best performance. I mean, that movie doesn't. I don't know that movie really comes off. There's something very queasy about it, but she's so good in it. She's so beautiful and so evil.
She's great. Like her, what you're saying is interesting too, because she's famous as a nymphette. I mean, but the roles she really sort of got recognized for are later. But I was wondering, I mean, I got interested enough to do this. I tracked down those early Dobie Gillis's.
Oh, really?
Yeah. She's a doll, Thalia Menninger. All right. I want to ask you this too. I want to say something before I ask the next question.
Yeah.
You know, you've written one of my favorite LA novels, which is American Dream Machine, which came out in 2013. And then I feel like you've written another one of my favorite LA novels, which is Always Crashing in the Same Car. And of course, you know what I mean? It's technically, it's nonfiction, it's memoir, it's cultural criticism, it's social history, it's all these things. But really, I think, in my own opinion, it is a novel. And I just wanted to know if you think that's a screwy opinion, or if you think that's right.
I do. No, I actually do, and I've described it that way privately, and I think one or two times in public too. And you know, it's a strange. I was thinking, you know, even as I was walking the dog before we got on this conversation, like how exactly that's true. You know, on the one hand, I sort of feel like because you know the book is the factual stuff is factual. You know, the autobiographical stuff is autobiographical. I'm not, other than kind of, rearranging some things for timeline purposes and, just the kind of normal thing, or, reconstituting conversations that may not have gone verbatim the way I say they did. But, you know, it is in that sense, the sort of memoiristic aspects of it are not invented or anything like that. But I think, you know, first of all, I think that I do like the idea that of kind of re-expanding the idea of the novel, or just reminding people that like a novel can actually be, you know, 96% fact, right? And a novel can also hold criticism and hold, you know, quotation and hold, you know, all kinds of kind of crazy things that we don't always think of when we think of the province of the novel. But I also think, you know, some people have said to me, a couple people have said to me, like, you know, this book is so fun to read, like probably wasn't that fun to write because it's, you know, because the subject matter is dark. And I think actually it was enormous fun to write. And, you know, the reason it was fun to write is because it involved the kind of the invention of a persona. Like the narrator is, you know, he may
you, but not you, right?
Yes, right. He adheres to my kind of biographical outline, but I don't feel that he's exactly me. He can't be, because, you know, because there's a, you know, because that's what storytelling is. And I think once you get into, you know, the kind of creation of persona, which is what, you know, which is what I'm into,
Yeah.
you know, at least on the page, then you really are kind of riding along the line of fiction, whether you want to be or not, or at least riding along, you know, you're writing imaginative prose. And that's really what I'm interested in.
In a lot of ways, the distinctions are non-existent too. I mean,
yes, I think I did an interview with Jeff Dyer for the Paris Review. I did Jeff Dyer's Paris Review interview. I flew to Iowa City, where my friend John Dominy, I see, is with us tonight. Hello, Mr. Dominy. But I, you know, I went there to, you know, those Paris Review interviews are, you know, they call them either the art of fiction or the art of nonfiction. And as soon as we started talking, Jeff wanted to sort of tussle about that distinction, which he thought was total bullshit. Yeah. And you know, much as I think that given the state, given the nature of truth telling in the public sphere and the sort of condition of the Fourth Estate and all of that, I do think that, like, you know, there are things you don't fuck around with when you're practicing journalism, when you're reporting. You know, these are all things I firmly believe in. You know, I do think that there's a way in which a nonfiction writer has to be faithful, or as faithful as possible, to fact, in a way. But I also think an imaginative prose writer has to be faithful to the demands of imagination. And I think a memoirist has to also.
You even just said it in the portion you read. It true without being accurate.
Yes. Right. Even though what I'm talking about is
I know
of something a certain kind of Southerner, you know, a guy who tells stories, you know, that's something slightly different. But you know, all of this is, I think, you know, when you write anything, you are grappling with, even if you're writing a piece of fiction, you know, if it's not purely speculative or sort of fabulous, you know, there are, you know, likely to be relations to real events or real people, or, you know, even if they're highly coded, right? Even in this book, there are, you know, everybody who's a real person exists under either an initial, or, you know, occasionally, if they're a famous person, I don't, you know, if they're a famous person existing in the span of my real life, right? There's an actor that I go to work for in New York that I don't identify, who is meant to be fairly transparently identifiable as Robert De Niro, because that's who I did work for. And then there's one or two other people who I conceal for reasons of wanting to protect their privacy. But you know, you're trafficking. You're always trafficking somewhere in a connection to real life.
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I want to ask you too. I'm going to read you a quote from Michael Tolkien. Okay. Please. Yeah, it's from his piece That Was Then, which is about early 80s LA, driving the freeway at night, coked out, looking for porn. Right, we've all been there. But he said, this was during the time when everything was numb, but the numbness was pleasant. The numbness expressed a harmonic correspondence with the vibrations of a city whose depths of dread and despair were unknowable except through degradation. Shattering coherence, cocaine reorganized what was freshly random into a new level of occult significance. My dealer was a chiropractor. His grandfather was a bootlegger. Under the influence, a celebration could be made of this knowledge. Okay. I feel like, yeah, no, it's great, but I feel like this entire book was written under the influence and a celebration of the knowledge that your drug dealer had a bootlegger for a granddad. That's what this book is about. I mean, it's you making
my book or Michael's book?
Yours, because I feel like you're all about making kind of bold and improbable connections between things. The structuring principle, I really, what I was quoting that is I want to talk about the structuring principle of your book, how you decided who was in it and who wasn't. Because you're seeing connections all the time.
I see what you mean. I want to take a moment though to push back on one thing because I really that passage is quite beautiful and I'm a big fan of Michael's. I really I think that both as a filmmaker, you know, his movie The New Age, like he's written and directed some movies that I think are quite masterful, and of course. The Player and you know Escape from Dannemora, the TV show that he put. Like I think Michael is a great writer. I also think that passage, as good as it is, which really speaks to a quality that you know, I think that version of LA, this sort of like numbed out cocaine Los Angeles, that was very real. I mean, I that's certainly that was, you know, I felt the pressure of that world when I was a teenager, and I think that. I talk at the beginning about needing to get out of Los Angeles, and that was the thing I needed to get away from. And that is also the version of Los Angeles in many ways that I'm writing against, you know, both because it doesn't really conform with the LA that I've, you know, lived in as an adult. And, you know, it's like I sort of think that LA is a sort of like the sort of like, you know, cocaine pleasure dome, the source of sort of, empty and horrifying beauty. I mean, all that stuff.
As it lays.
Yes, right, and that to me feels like that's, you know, that's my parents' generation.
No, but I didn't.
What you're talking about here is pattern recognition, and about and that is a really, you know, what fascinates me about the construction of this book, and again, I think this is a way in which, you know. When you refer to it as a novel, I think this is also true because, you know, there are 9 different people in this book, you know, Fitzgerald, Eleanor Perry, Carol Eastman, Tom McGavin, Hal Ashby, Michael Cimino, Warren Zevon, Tuesday Weld, Renata Adler, 9 people. And they really don't, on the face of it, have anything to do with each other. They are, you know, they are working in different, you know, some of them, there are of course coincidental points of intersection between them, right? Wherein Tom McGavin writes a screenplay and Frank Perry, Eleanor's ex-husband, winds up directing it. Warren Zevon, you know, I knew I was going to write about Warren Zevon, and then I was like, oh, he and McGavin were buddies, like, you know, you know, Tuesday Weld appears in Play As It Lays, which is the movie that Eleanor Perry and Frank Perry split up over. So there are those kind of coincidental overlaps, but that's not enough to make that wouldn't really be enough to unify these people into a sort of constellation, right?
Right.
And I think what does unify them is me, is the narrator and the kind of ways that I manage to tell their stories in ways that, you know, shine light on each other or connect. And in that regard, they really are like characters in a novel, right? In that way. So, you know, I think that the joy of writing anything is the joy of finding, you know, is discovering the way that things connect. Or I think, you know, lots of writers will have this experience where you're writing something and the materials for it just keep showing up in your daily life. It's like, you know, you're stuck on a scene and you look out the window, or you pick up a newspaper or something, and there's the piece of information you didn't know you were looking for. You know, there's a providential aspect to it. And I think, and that even in the case of this book, it was like, Tuesday Weld was the person that I pulled out of a hat, where I was like, oh, that's who I needed. Yes, you're right. Tuesday Weld is exactly the person that I wanted to be writing about here.
There's also this sense, I mean, you grow up in LA and you leave as soon as you possibly reasonably can. You want to get away.
Yeah.
Coming back as an adult, as a grown person, all of Los Angeles is your Madeline, if I'm saying that right. It's the Proust thing. I mean, it's like you're gorging yourself on your Madeline, just being back in the city itself, because it has so many associations for you, right?
Right.
And I just wanted to kind of talk about kind of why you left. You say it in the book, but I'd like you to talk about it, why you left and why you decided to come back.
Yeah.
By the way, I see this we were talking about our mutual friend, Bret Easton Ellis, and him coming back in 2006. It seems the same for him. It just seems so fraught.
Yeah. I mean, I think Bret, I didn't know Bret growing up, even though when he went to Bennington, when he went away to college to Bennington, actually, it's not Mark Norris was not his roommate. He was Jonathan's roommate. But I feel like we were
one step away.
One step away. But he was in the Valley, and I was, and that was a big distinction, right? And his family was not connected to the movie business at all, and mine was. But I think we were operating in that we both grew up, and he's 3 years older than me, too, whatever. But I think there is that Los Angeles between like 1979 and 1988. So, whatever the kind of bracket of our respective adolescences really was a dangerous place.
Yeah.
I mean, dangerous even if you were middle class, which or even greater than middle class, because because drugs were so rampant. And, I think the kind of me generation, the kind of, was really the age when one's parents were, our boomer or silent generation parents were kind of having their own crises, right? And so we were sort of left to our own devices, and it felt like a very easy place to die.
Yeah.
I know I just feel like a lot of kids that I knew in high school, a lot of kids that I knew growing up, didn't make it out of their teens. And that was the culture, or that was at least kind of what the culture was conducive to. There was this sense that like we could, when I was talking with my friend Adam Fowler the other night, it was like, we could just disappear to Mexico for 3 days. Like no one would notice, no one did notice. And, while that might look or sound fun when you're 15, and when I might have even convinced myself at the time that a lot of it was fun, I was terrified. I just thought like, I got to get out of here. Like there are no guardrails. And I think, some of that passage that you read from Michael, had that quality too, where, even though Michael was an adult, it's like, wait, you're buying cocaine from your chiropractor? Like your health professionals are selling you drugs. Like it felt that way. And I think, so I think at the time I thought, I gotta, I gotta get to the East where, not where
standards.
Yeah, well, where
Codes
there's
of conduct.
where kind of, maybe it was codes of conduct. Maybe there was a sense of like civilization is there, or culture, because what I had when I was a teenager was literature, and I was like, really, that was what was going to save my life, was reading and writing. It was what did save my life, and I thought, well, reading and writing, that's what people do in New York. They don't do that here, So it was obvious that I had to go. And then when I did go, I was like, oh, like, I went to school at, Hampshire, which was like a sort of kooky liberal arts college that, frankly, was just at least as druggy as Los Angeles. And then, and then moved to the Bay Area with my girlfriend, and then moved to New York. And somewhere in there, I kind of came to grips with the fact that like, oh, the problem wasn't LA. The problem was my you know, and maybe, you know, and I do think LA has changed so much since then that, you know, not that people don't still do those things, they do them everywhere, but I think it has become a much more, you know, much more interesting place, just in terms of, you know, writers being here and artists being here, and it's not, doesn't feel purely driven by the movie business. I mean, it's like, you know, I don't have that much contact with the movie business except when I'm writing something, writing a script. But I think I sort of realized like, oh, it's okay. Like, and I realized not only is it okay, it's like, it's the world that I have, that I still feel some sort of love and attachment to, and my friends are here, and, you know, and now that my parents have grown up, or in my mom's case passed away, but now that my dad is not in middle-age crisis mode, yeah. He's wonderful to be around, and my stepmom and my daughter, and, you know, so it's a different place. It's just a completely different place.
Well, you know, it's funny, you say that about the artist, but we also have Babitz in common, and I always remember her saying the thing about LA is the artists were always here because you know, Hollywood paid people.
Yes.
So, you know, like having Stravinsky in her living room.
Right.
But some of it's just also the age, like when you're an adolescent, wherever you are sucks and you got to get somewhere else, you know?
That's right. I mean, and that's, I think, really what I'm getting at is it's like, I realized like, oh, it wasn't real. The problem wasn't really, I mean, even if in some ways it might've been LA because it was, or, you know, I don't know what it was like to be in, you know, New Jersey or Chicago at that time, but maybe not that dissimilar. Like, I think the culture was much more.
It was with Gen X.
Right.
Gen X, feral children. Actually, you brought up your dad, and what was your dad? So you mentioned that your dad was in Jeff Corey's acting class, and
yes.
Jeff Corey, you can explain who Jeff Corey is.
Jeff Corey was an actor who was blacklisted, you know, during the 50s by the, you know, Hollywood, by the HUAC hearings, and he became a teacher. He had been a working actor, and then because he couldn't work, he became a teacher, and he had this acting class that all the young kind of rising actors and even some of the filmmakers of the 60s took. Jack Nicholson was in that class, Warren Oates was in that class, Harry Dean Stanton was in that class, Carol Eastman was in that class, was Peter Fonda, maybe, you know, just a ton
Jane was in it.
Right.
And Robert Towne.
Yeah, and Robert Towne, the screenwriter. So all these people were in this class. Even my dad, who, you know, my dad's not an actor and has never wanted to be an actor. So I think, you know, but he took the class. It was just a thing that people did. But it was also directly across the street from his house, was directly opposite Eve Babitz's. And Babitz was at that time a teenager, right?
Not even.
65? Yeah, just a kid.
Just a kid. I actually was really trying to maneuver you. I wanted to ask this. I brought up Robert Towne. I was curious, did you ever consider putting him in?
I mean, I could have, you know, I mean, right.
I know.
But I guess I think of Towne as, I mean, he's such a, I realize that like any screenwriter, like his career has had, you know, had peaks and valleys, you know, right. But I think he's the gold standard for like being a you know, I mean, I think him and William Goldman probably well, you know, you can't call anybody the greatest screenwriter of the 70s, but, you know, he wrote Chinatown. What more do you need to do? Like, if you write Chinatown, you're on Mount Olympus forever.
You're on Mount Olympus forever, but you know, just the hierarchy of Hollywood as a screenwriter, you're never the top anything, right? Or that was, I just was curious. And I also, you know, I don't like Chinatown. We've had this conversation. I think it's congealed, but we both love his, introduction to this Chinatown screenplay, which is really fine writing about LA. It's
amazing. Yeah, it's one of my favorite pieces. And it said something, there's something that he says in there about how, you know, he went out to Catalina to write that script, and he says something to the effect that he wasn't really interested. It was never for him about like telling some story about like water rights and all this crazy shit. It was really just about trying to evoke the texture and the feel of a time and place. And it kind of startled me that would have been you never think of that as a screenwriter's motivation. You think like a screenwriter, you know, and I'm sure he had other ones because it is such a beautiful script. But you know, you think a screenwriter, what does a screenwriter want to do? They want to get money, they want to get paid, they want to write, a great noir or whatever, but to find out, oh, like that would be a screenwriter's motivation, because it's definitely my motivation as a when I'm writing anything, is I always want to, it's always about trying to sort of capture the texture of experience, or trying to capture certain things that are gone. Even if that's not the point, even if that's not the, that's not for the reader, that's for me. But I want the reader to feel those things. I want the reader to feel the presence of those places, or those items, or whatever it is that I'm trying to catch in a scene. Those bits of detail that are like really the secret point of the whole thing.
Well, I know we have to turn this over to questions, but I just wanted to say, just me to you, when I was thinking about how to describe the book, I mean, if I was going to describe Always Crashing, I would say it was as if there was, if like Proust and Joe Gillis from Sunset Boulevard got into a car wreck, this book would be the result. You know what I mean?
I'll take that. I mean, yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Very, very serious. That would be my comp. But Spencer, I don't want to overstep our bounds. Do you want to do questions?
We're more than welcome to continue on this line of thought. I love it.
Yeah, I want to ask. I want to ask Lili one question while we're here.
Yeah,
which is,
please.
Lili, just because you keep sort of circling around the question of this as a novel, and I would ask, where would you put Slow Days, Fast Company? Like, is that a novel?
I think that these two books are very similar. I would put those two books. It's reinventing the form, but it's a prismatic view of L.A. You know. I mean, my problem with like something like Play It As It Lays, it's a tunnel vision. It's a very narrow vision of Los Angeles. It's the Sodom and how do you say it? Gomorrah? Sodom and Gomorrah. Yeah, vision of Los Angeles, where it's a complicated and sprawling city. And so the prismatic approach, which Slow Days, Eve Babitz's book, Slow Days, Fast Company, and Always Crashing, it's a total point of commonality. And you kind of reinvent a form. I mean, I think you kind of invented a form to write this book.
Yeah, well, hopefully you do with it. I mean, I think it's always the, even if you're just, I feel like I have to find some formal challenge in what I'm doing, or else it's, why do it? Yeah. But I think, Slow Days, Fast Company was such a, incredible drink of water to me, because it was one of the first books I'd read that really seemed to not present LA in a kind of sinister light, or in light of, what, like that passage you read from Michael, or like Brett, or like Joan Didion, right? Where the view of LA is sort of, cold. And she loves it, Eve loves it in that book. And that to me was like, oh, you can do that. You're actually allowed to love that, to love this city. And it's funny that for someone who really didn't care for it when I was younger, like I think that my writings about LA are quite loving, because that's how I feel about it. Yeah. I mean, conflicted, because
hatred, because you're you, but like hatred's a form of love too. I mean,
that's right.
Yeah, it's passion.
Yeah, this actually kind of dovetails and connects really well with one of our audience Q&A questions here from John Dominy, who was kind of, you mentioned the chat before. He says, this was actually from about 15 minutes ago, from what you were talking about, fiction versus nonfiction. And he says, this speculation regarding fiction and nonfiction seems to invite comparison with your book's real hero and anti-hero, namely the city of Los Angeles. Can you take this conversation about the city's idiosyncratic overlay of grit portrayed in nonfiction and glamour in fiction, I think is what he's trying to say.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a great question. And I would say, I think, and it reminds me, because I'm reading John's book right now. John himself has a memoir, The Archaeology of a Good Ragu, which is in a very strange way, very similar to Always Crashing, or incidentally so, in that it's about his voyage to Naples, and it's revolves around his father, much as this book revolves around my mom. There's something I was intrigued to feel like, oh, here's this other wonderful writer working in a kind of not work in reinventing the form for himself in a similar way. So maybe I'm onto something. If I think let's see. I want to just run that question back. Take the conversation of the city's idiosyncratic overlay of grit and glamour. Yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, one of the things that startled me in while I was writing this was to discover that to discover after the fact that I had written a noir. And you know, that this book is kind of a noir. You know, it has a very kind of noir setup in that, you know, just even from the beginning where I kind of move into some shitty apartment off the strip, and it, you know, there's a slightly hard-boiled tone in it, you know, and obviously just in terms of watching a lot of the movies that I was watching while I was researching this book, you know, LA is the noir. It's the best city for noir. It's the best city in which, you know, noirs are set. It's a noir tradition of Chandler and all of that. You know, I think that it's hard not to be, you know, it's hard not to be influenced by that, you know, and I think insofar as the voyage of any good noir is the unraveling of a sort of municipal corruption, right? That's the plot, and that's the plot of this book too. I think I'm sort of, you know, unraveling a corruption within myself that is the corruption of Hollywood, the corruption of, you know, ideals of success or sort of, you know, reward that the movie business or even just America, because this book is really, you know, I think hopefully a little wider than just the movie business.
Well,
you know,
Los Angeles is the ultimate American city, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it is. Others may differ.
Total self-invention. I mean, it seems like it seemed just fundamentally American in a way no other city is. Actually, I wanted to ask you, it's off of John's question, but the preoccupation in this book with failure. Right. And I was thinking to myself, tragedy probably is European and failure, which is kind of rinky-dinkier, is so American to me. And but I wanted you actually to talk about LA as kind of the ultimate American city.
Well, I mean, you know, I think, you know, irrespective of the fact that obviously there are numerous East Coast and Midwestern cities that have been here a lot longer, I do think that the sort of the frontier aspect of Los Angeles, or the aspect of this place that invites self-invention, self-reinvention, you know, Sam, my wife and I have been rewatching Mad Men, which is on the one hand, obviously a tremendously New York show, right? And I think that, you know, but it's also a show that can't keep its protagonist, who is obsessed with this, you know, who is a pure piece of self-invention, right? That's what Don Draper is. And he's, you know, constantly sort of, you know, saying, you know, he's constantly wiping the slate clean, you know, starting over and starting over and starting over. And that is Los Angeles. That is extremely Los Angeles. And that's why the show ultimately can't keep Don Draper, right? That sort of avatar of 20th century American masculinity. Like, he can't help but wind up here, you know, right? And so I do think that there is something about that. There is, you know, the sort of, even though I think that, you know, this country is in an enormous amount of trouble, largely based on its unwillingness to reckon with any sense of its own history at all, or to reckon honestly with that history. You know, it's like, this has always been the blank slate, and LA is, you know, LA and Vegas. Those are the two cities that seem to offer that most aggressively. Yeah.
I have another question here from Catherine Taylor. Thank you for your question, Catherine, who asks, this has been, or she says, this has been the most engaging 45 minutes of conversation I can remember. I wish it could go on for 4 more hours. Matthew, can you talk a little bit about this book in relation to the one you're writing now, in the connections or similarities, and how this book informs the next?
Yeah, I love this question. Hello, Catherine. It's not going to go on for 4 hours, I promise, only for about 10 minutes. Yes, the book I'm writing now is also a memoir, but of a very, like, I would say both of a more traditional kind and of a less traditional kind. The book is at least tentatively called The Golden Hour, and it's really about, we were so lucky not having that happen yet. Hey, pilot. The book I'm writing now is, you know, it's really about the rise and fall of the fall of the studio system, and about kind of my father, as I think I allude to in this book, is a talent agent. My mother is a failed screenwriter, and it kind of dives back into the it starts in the kind of mid 50s to talk about my dad going to work for MCA for Lou Wasser, for a talent agent named Lou Wasserman, and kind of follows their narrative and my narrative through and the narratives of many other people. I'm only about 150 pages in, but it's on the one hand, it's like, well, I'm a character, my dad's a character, my mom's a character, also characters in this are Lou Wasserman, Ronald Reagan, Jack Nicholson, Arthur Penn, Jack Warner. Like, it's got this kind of panoramic, I'm both sort of telling the story of my own family and a story that's about the movies themselves and how the movies kind of came to occupy a certain kind of central, place in American life, not just in the context of Hollywood, but in the context of really inventing Ronald Reagan and inventing, the kind of, cauldron that we're all kind of stuck in now, and how kind of the collapse of the movies as both sort of a central part of American cultural life. I think that the movies, as a thing that people would go to see and go to discuss, have sort of been elbowed aside first by television and now by the streaming platforms, which is a whole other thing. I think it's a book about the transition from analog life to digital life, but it's also a family story. It's much more like a novel in some ways than this, just in terms of being very kind of scene dominated and story dominated. Hopefully it'll work. We'll see. You never know when you're in the middle of it. You never know.
We have another question from Dan Christians. Good to see you here, Dan. He says, I read the book out of order. I read the pieces about people who were, personally important to me: Hal Ashby, Thomas McGuane, Warren Zevon, and maybe missed some of the through line. But is it possible to talk more about the memoir arc of the book? I also wanted to talk about, or wondered if you could talk about McGuane and his importance to the story you're telling.
Yes, it's interesting because I think, obviously the book divides on one level. There are 8 sections, and each one kind of focuses on a specific person. So, and you referred to it in your introduction, Spencer, as an essay collection, which I don't think it is. Although I'm never offended if someone wants to take it that way, and I kind of like the idea of someone reading it out of order in a hopscotchy way. McGuane, who I think the section about McGuane is I think of it as the kind of the central, like it's like the tent pole, that the thing that holds the whole narrative up. But in a way, it's also kind of a bottle, in that episode, that section is really about my adolescence and about my discovering McGuane as sort of a certain kind of archetype. I think McGuane, during the moment of his highest popularity in the early 70s, was, got that whole kind of like, he's the next Hemingway, National Book Award nominee, and then he did what you would expect a novelist in that position to do, which is he came to L.A. to make movies and make money. The great thing about McGuane is that he did that, and then he stopped. He departed. And so, when I was a teenager and I first read him, I was like, this guy's amazing. Just the quality of the sentences and the sort of chaos and the energy of the writing itself was thrilling to me. But I also felt that his, unlike Fitzgerald, who was just kind of eaten alive by the movie business, McGuane did it and then stopped and then went home and resumed writing fiction. And more than that, like wrote some of his best fiction, and I think it's still, like, I think his, even though I think people don't, he's not kind of as much in the sort of public consciousness at all as he was in the early 70s. His later work is really great. It's probably better than his early work, even if it's not nearly as sort of chaotic. So, that notion of someone surviving Hollywood, of a writer you know, a novelist surviving Hollywood was crucial, you know, to my vision of the book, and I think crucial to my vision of myself. You know, Daniel, you ask about the arc of the book, and you know, I don't know how it would you know, seem if one reads it out of order, but I think there's this kind of, it's really fairly subtle because it's happening through the stories that I'm telling of other people more than it's, you know, it's not there are events that befall me in the book, but the sort of the transformation that the narrator undergoes, and I think he really does undergo one. You know, I think there's a way in which the person at the beginning of the book is you know, posited as being disappointed, somewhat embittered, you know, ambitious in a kind of grabby way. And, you know, by the end of the book, hopefully, and at least to me, as I read it, that's not at all, you know, he's not really any of those things anymore. And I think it's funny to talk about that person in the narrator in the third person, since it's me, but there you have it. So, you know, that is the arc of the book. And I think, you know, the pleasure of how it gets, you know, the pleasure of how it gets there is why the book is designed to be read in order. Even though I know people are sometimes hopping to their favorite people, that's a temptation that's hard to resist.
Yeah, it's I was going to say this actually kind of leads into I think we have time for about one more question. I think this leads into this last question pretty well. Eric Peterson asks, I love the book and was going to ask you about the creation of the voice, but you just answered that, or he says you just answered that a bit, and he says you mentioned the Eve Babitz book, but can you also talk a little bit about the other books you mentioned, like Speedboat by Renata Adler, or the amazing Hadley Lee Lightcap?
Yeah, I would actually love to talk about Hadley Lee Lightcap, and I also want to say, just because I see other questions in the queue that I can answer in brief.
Yeah, of course.
Or my friend Mark Norris, who I went to high school with. Hey, Mark, what's up? He mentions comments on my obsessive use of parentheses, and I'm like, yep, parentheses, M dashes. Like, I know my syntax can be a little chaotic, and I think that's just how it is. It's
all better for it. Yeah.
Mirror what has something to do with kind of the structure of thought, I think. Sarah, you ask if I know David Thompson's book Suspects. I do not know that book, even though I love David Thompson. And if I start going off on how much I love David Thompson, I know Lili, we really would hold this up here. But I'm going to email you under separate cover about that book. As far as the other books that I mentioned, this book is obviously like overflowing with references to and invocations of other books, but two that I'm very, very, very partial to, besides Speedboat, which I hope you've all read, and if you haven't, please get yourself to the NYRB Classics store and buy that right away. But Hadley Lee Lightcap, which is a book by a writer named Sam Sweet, is one of my favorite things I've read in the last couple of years, and it's a strange book because it's really a monograph about a band, like and a band that a sort of forgotten LA band from the 90s called Acetone. And what's interesting about Sam's book is that it is sort of about that band. In fact, it is about that band. It's about the sort of rise and fall of a sort of fascinatingly odd, not quite great Los Angeles band, but it's really about kind of failure and sort of a sense of decay and of kind of loss, you know, a sense of you know, kind of what happens to your 20s when you're in your 40s. It's really quite beautiful, and like the book that I've written here, I think it does resist categorization. Like it's not really a book about music. It's not really a book about a band. I think of it as being very much like a novel, like a kind of nonfiction novel, in which the protagonists are these three musicians and the city. It's published by a very small press called All Night Menu, but I cannot recommend it highly enough. I think Sam is the most beautiful writer, you know, and I think that's a book that in a weird way kind of deserves a much wider audience. That, you know, for a book about a 90s rock band, it is surprisingly wide and evocative and incredibly moving. I find it just so beautiful. I couldn't stop. You know, it was one of those books that when I got it, I remember just, you know, reading it in the span of a day, and I kept stopping myself. I kept thinking, you know, I don't want this book to be over. So I had to keep putting it down, and then I couldn't, you know, 5 minutes later, I'd be like, just another few pages. So that's a great one. And the one other book that I mentioned in the novel that I think I would want to highlight here is Don Carpenter's book, Turnaround. That's a book that I think was recently reprinted by Counterpoint, if I'm not mistaken, in part of a volume called the Hollywood Trilogy. And that is a very, very, very special and very unusual, in that it's another book about someone who you expect them to be destroyed by Hollywood. They are not. It's a you know, book about a screenwriter in the 70s, and it's highly recommended.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew, for those recommendations. Before we wrap up tonight, do either of you have any parting thoughts before we go?
Not if I want to let people get out of here and mad or go to dinner, depending on where they are in the country. So I'm good. I've said enough.
No worries. All right. Well, my enormous gratitude once again to both of you for this really brilliant conversation. Thanks to all of you out there for spending your night with us. Seriously, go buy Always Crashing over on thirdplacebooks.com, or if you're local, you can come say hi to us or me in the Seattle area. Other than that, on behalf of the bookstore, please be well, everyone, and have a great evening.
Thank you all for coming.
So long.